Thank you all for coming. My name is Joe Caterine. I work for Virginia Sea Grant, but I'm also an independent journalist in my spare time. And I've been working with Mary Lassiter on this campaign to rename James Blair Middle School and Magruder Elementary. We're sort of playing around with changing the title of the campaign to No Enslaver School Names in the Williamsburg area. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So just out of curiosity, I know that some of the people here have seen this presentation or know about it, but if you want to put in the chat, what you know about James Blair or Magruder, and if you don't know anything, that's also fine. But yeah, I'll just give people a minute to type in the chat what, if anything, they know about these two individuals. And to clarify on the question that David asked earlier, James Blair Middle School is in Williamsburg and Magruder Elementary is in York County. Yep, James Blair was the president of William & Mary. He was a co-founder. And his status as a priest is definitely something that will come up in this presentation. Anybody else know anything? Yep, James Blair was also a slaveholder, and Magruder was a Civil War general. Some of you have probably heard of Fort Magruder around here. That's named after him, but more things are named after him, which I'll get into in the presentation. So before we get into it, I just wanted to share some of the reactions on social media that I got when I was promoting this webinar. If y'all want to just take a second to read those. And one thing that I want to point out is what the first comment references, that these people, people don't like slave owners, but it was a part of history you can't change. I don't know if y'all have seen in the news, but the NAACP this week sued the Shenandoah County School Board for restoring their Confederate names. And in response, the school board members had a very similar reasoning to what's in these comments, that they see it as they're preserving history by restoring the Confederate names to the schools. And I think taking giving these comments the benefit of the doubt, I think the woke narrative thing is a little silly, but I do think, what this other person says about, that there are important issues, that's true, but I do think that these school names are much more integral than people take for granted. Monty, I see your question. I don't believe either of these two donated money to the school, just because the schools were named much later. And I'll get into that when they were named, because that is important. So this is W.B. Du Bois. I sort of wanted to reference him because I think, he provides a really good way of understanding this topic. The Propaganda of History is the name of the last chapter of his book, Black Reconstruction in America. And I'm just going to read this quote really quick because I think it's really good. He says, "One is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, skimmed over. We must forget that George Washington was a slave owner, or that Thomas Jefferson had mixed children, or that Alexander Hamilton had Negro blood, and simply remember the things we regard as creditable and inspiring. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive and example. It paints perfect men in noble nations, but it does not tell the truth." And later on in that chapter, Du Bois says that the point of his book, that book that I just cited, is to establish the truth so that what's right can be built on it. And so, in no, I'm not, saying like our campaign is anywhere near on the level of what Du Bois or contributed with his book or his body of work, but I think his sort of perspective and his way of looking at it is sort of what's been guiding my thought, and I just want y'all to keep that in mind as we go through the presentation, because what he means when he says propaganda of history is that history really, the way that it's told, informs the way that we view it or that we think about it. And in Black Reconstruction, he was really combating what a lot of historians at the time were saying about Reconstruction, that it was a failure, and that it was a failure because of the Black leaders that rose up and took part in it after the Civil War. And he said that's completely not true, and that those Black leaders accomplished incredible things, and it was only because of the reaction of former enslavers and plantation owners that Reconstruction didn't succeed. But so just keep that in mind as we're going through the presentation. So let's get into who these guys were. So first off, we have James Blair. As somebody pointed out in the comments, he was an enslaver, and I think I went to William and Mary, and I think maybe I had heard that he had held enslaved people, but I didn't understand to what degree he was an advocate for slavery, and that in many ways he's responsible for slavery being institutionalized in Virginia. So one quote that I pulled from the Magazine of History in Virginia is that he was convinced that making ministers slaveholders would be the most effectual expedient for furnishing this country with a learned, pious, and diligent clergy. What that means is that he was petitioning the Anglican Church to allow churches in Virginia to hold enslaved people as a way to encourage British ministers to move to the colony. And Blair wasn't just doing this because he cared about the church, but at the time, the church and education were very much tied together, including the College of William and Mary. And so Blair had a financial interest in making the College of William and Mary do well by making more ministers come to Virginia. And the main way that he saw to do this was by the enslavement of Africans and using their bondage to his advantage. So some other facts about him is that he loaned College of William and Mary its first enslaved people. As I mentioned, he petitioned both not just the Anglican Church, but also other I guess you would call them like statesmen in Virginia at the time to institutionalize slavery. And then something that I learned more recently is that the college purchased the Nottoway plantation. I don't know if people have heard about that, but that was a tobacco plantation that the college owned while he was president of William and Mary, and it held 17 enslaved workers. And the history department right now at William and Mary is really digging into that, because it's really like a incredibly understudied part of the college's history. And I suspect that what they'll find is that Blair had a major role in purchasing it. And then to get to Magruder. So when you look at Confederate General John B. Magruder online, even his Wikipedia page, it's sort of atrocious in how it completely ignores his stance on slavery or his opinion on it as an institution. It usually will talk about his colorful personality, and how he was a big socialite. He was apparently a drunk too. I'm not totally sure on that point, but yeah, I have a quote from him before the Civil War where he says, "No sane man believes the South will ever part with its slaves at the bidding of the North, or that there is a Southerner who will not sacrifice his life in the defense of his property guaranteed to him by the Constitution." So we see that he was a staunch defender of slavery from before the Civil War. And during the Civil War, he, commanded the Confederate forces on the peninsula, and he's specifically remembered by some, at least, for the burning of Hampton in 1861, where he targeted Hampton specifically because of intelligence he had received that people who had emancipated from slavery were staying there. And so and then in 1864 he gave a specific order where he said that if his forces encountered enemy combatants that included Black soldiers, to not take any prisoners and to kill them all instead. And then even after the Civil War, he fled to Mexico and was part of this ex-Confederate collective that was trying to establish a pro-slavery colony in Mexico. They were not successful. So now that we've gone over who these two individuals were, the truth, about who they were, I want to share some perspectives from people in our community about how learning about the history behind these individuals later in life really had a negative impact on them and was sort of traumatizing. So Mary Lassiter is I would say, my co-organizer with this campaign. She was really the one who started it all, and I've sort of been following her lead. But really, the whole Lassiter family has really been, sort of outstanding in their, trying to raise awareness about the history behind these names and trying to get these school names changed. So in this audio clip that I'm going to play, Mary's going to talk about how she was part of the first integrated class in Williamsburg. And that class graduated from James Blair when it was still a high school. And one of the things that she talks about when I interviewed her for my podcast is, they would walk into the school and see this huge mural that you can see on this slide where it shows James Blair. You can see him sort of on the left there. I cropped it to make it fit on this slide, and then you can see sort of a African man sort of portrayed to be submissive, as like an enslaved person. And I'll just play the clip and you can hear for yourself.
We're not hearing it.
Oh, okay, you can't hear it. Let me see. Oh, well, that's too bad. But it was a short clip anyway. But yeah, she's basically saying, that they weren't taught anything about James Blair when she attended school there, and that it was only until 2020 when she read an article in the Virginian Pilot that contained an interview with Jennifer Ost, who's also a William and Mary graduate, but she's now a history professor in Pennsylvania. And she sort of studied James Blair, and she talked about what I referenced earlier about how he was really an advocate for institutionalizing slavery in Virginia. Okay, so at least with this clip, we've got subtitles. So even if you can't hear it, you can sort of watch the subtitles. But this is Carl Lassiter, who I believe is on the call. And this is just him talking about the same thing about learning about the history of Magruder later in life. So I'll go ahead and play it. And yeah, the subtitles, you'll have to read along. But this picture at the beginning here is a clip from the Daily Press from, I believe, 1954. where it clearly states that the school was named. You can see on the bottom there for a Confederate general. Remember that because I'm going to bring it up later, but here's the clip.
Still no volume.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the no volume, but I'll just keep playing it with the subtitles. All right, yeah, sorry again about the lack of volume, but yeah, I guess we'll just have to deal with that. But so yeah, as I think we talked about, or as I referenced earlier, the when the schools were named is really important. So we know from newspaper coverage that Magruder Elementary was named in 1920, and James Blair was named in 1954. And you can see from these newspaper clippings, both these schools went through changes throughout their history, but the name stayed. So Magruder used to be, or it became part of Camp Perry temporarily and sort of moved around before its current location on Penniman Road. And then James Blair, like we talked about, was originally a high school. Then it got switched to a middle school. And then it underwent renovations that made it considered to be an entirely new school, which I'll talk about later. But the reason why these 2 years are important is because they coincide with 2 surges in naming schools and monuments after Confederate or enslaver names, which we can see in this next graph, which is from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So you can see in these years of the Jim Crow era, which is when Magruder was named, there's just this incredible surge of naming monuments, other buildings. And then with James Blair, which would have been 1954 right here, there's also this big uptick in naming schools after Confederate officers or enslavers. And that's because these namings were really meant to send a message to people, who thought that the Black community should have equal rights, that they should have equal access to education, etc. And so now we're going to get into a little bit of history about, education in Virginia. And, I think just as bad as sort of ignoring all of the history, I think it's just as bad to say that it was all bad, because we actually have some pretty incredible history as far as public education goes in Virginia. And I do want to just point out really quickly that W.E.B. Du Bois makes this point in his book that public education in the South really came about, free public education, I should say, came about through the Black community pushing and demanding it. And does anybody, if you have a guess as to what this tree is on the left here, go ahead and throw a guess in the chat.
That's the Emancipation Tree in at Hampton
That's
University.
right. Yep, that's yeah, they call it the Emancipation Oak. And this is Mary Peak. She was one of the first Black educators in the South following the Civil War, and she would give her first lessons under this tree. And then it's said that she also read the Emancipation Proclamation to the community under this tree, which is how it got that name. But she also went on to later found Hampton University, which is where the tree is, and you can go visit it. But she is a much unsung hero in the history of Virginia and education. So just wanted to give her a shout out. Unfortunately, there's also not not so great Virginia history when it comes to education. This is a statue of Harry Byrd that got taken down a couple of years ago in Richmond. It's the only photo of him that I felt like showing. But he was a very, infamous sort of racist who really originated the massive resistance movement, which was a reaction to the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, where he was really pushing and convinced people in other states as well to push for desegregation, and led to policies in Virginia that caused a lot of schools to close because they weren't able to comply with these essentially racist policies. And so I just wanted to point that out really quick because I think it's important to remember, that it's not like, slavery existed back before the Civil War and then it just completely disappeared. We see people who are still, throughout the 20th century, pushing for the idea that, the Black community doesn't deserve the same access to education or access to the same quality of life, to the same civil rights, etc. And so now to get local, talking about integration and segregation. So Magruder was the white school in the area known as East Williamsburg. And Frederick Douglass Elementary was the Black school at the time. There was also a Black high school called James Weldon Johnson. This picture here is of staff from Frederick Douglass at the time. And do I have subtitles on this clip? This is Buck Lassiter. He's another of Mary's brothers. Let me see yeah, so I have subtitles. So please excuse the lack of sound, but if you want to read along with the subtitles.
I want.
He can hear you.
He can hear me now.
Hey, Mary.
Joe, can you hear me? Joe, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not that technology savvy. I
Yeah.
just wanted to clear up one thing. Magruder Elementary was its own school, and then Frederick Douglass became Magruder Annex.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna keep playing this video.
Amani, Amani, Amani. Look, you know about this.
Yeah, and I also want to, like, coming to the present, like, our campaign is really building on the past few years of activism around this issue. The protest against the Magruder school name in particular sort of gained speed after 2020. I shared a couple of letters both to the newspaper and to the school board on this slide. And even the York County teachers were speaking out against it, like this history teacher, Sam Muir, where I think he says very eloquently, that the name is tied to the Confederacy. It's very simple. The name represents a time of oppression, a time we should no longer be living in. And the reason why he's having to state what seems like an obvious fact like this is because York County policy states that schools have to be named after areas and not people. And so what the school division has said in response to this opposition so far is that it's named after the Magruder area, which was a historic Black community in Williamsburg, rather than being named after the Confederate general. But like I showed you in that newspaper clipping earlier, it's sort of indisputable proof that the school was named after the Confederate general. And it's very likely that the Magruder area itself is also named after the general. There are a lot of things named Magruder in this area and on the peninsula, and it's because of Fort Magruder. And then as well with James Blair, there was sort of a missed opportunity to rename it, where when it was renovated several years ago, back in 2017, it was renovated to such an extent that the Virginia Department of Education considered it a new school. And so by that code, that state code, they were required to change the name. And what they ended up doing was doing an online survey asking for people's input on the name. And the first option was to keep the name James Blair. And there was no additional education done to inform the community about the history of James Blair. It was sort of just put out there without really any extra effort. And so the name just stayed the same. Now, while we're still needing to change these names in our area, in the surrounding areas, there have been a lot of progress with, the Newport News School Division changing its own Magruder Elementary to Discovery STEM Academy back in 2016. In 2020, the city of Hampton renamed Magruder Boulevard to Neil Armstrong Parkway. And since, according to Education Week, the magazine, since 2020, at least 61 Confederate named schools have changed names, and 35 of those were in Texas or Virginia. Now, what we're really encouraging and pushing for in our campaign is for the community to have, a real conversation about these names and about what names would be reflect equity and inclusion in our school division. A couple of names that we've come up with are Madeline G. She was the first Black teacher at James Blair High School, and Reverend James B. Tabb Sr. He was a very prominent community leader around here, to such an extent that the Virginia House of Delegates honored him after he passed away with a joint resolution. And now, like I mentioned earlier in this presentation, there's also been the opposite happening where, some Confederate names for schools have been restored, like in Shenandoah County back in May. And then just this week, the NAACP sued that board, saying that they were violating Black students' constitutional rights And you can see the quote from the Virginia State Conference president. By celebrating the memory of these traitors every time a child walked through the school doors, by embracing the cold wind of intolerance and division and sensitivity, the Shenandoah County School Board has resurrected the ghosts of the Jim Crow era. And I just want to harp on that point a little bit, because, like I referenced at the beginning with the reactions to this, people saying, oh, we should be focusing on bigger issues. We should just be focusing on real issues, not just like a school name. But these schools, like the NAACP Virginia president pointed out, it's a name that the students see every time they walk in the building. It's printed on their school records. It will be on their resumes, when they're applying for jobs. It goes on any clothing, anything like that. It's really part of the school's brand, and it really sort of sticks with students for the rest of their lives. And I also think it really does tie to a lot of these other issues, because we have people on the school board like Michael Hosang and Linda Fairman from York County, who are openly saying or pushing racist views. They might be doing it in sort of a clever way, but like Hosang was arguing to segregate certain students just because they spoke a different language. And that's like the same sort of exclusion that these school names sort of promote and project. And we have to see how the way that we name our buildings and these sort of cornerstones of our education system also sort of shape the rhetoric and the parameters of the way that our school board discussions go. And so just to wrap up, and there'll be time for questions after this, but you can scan these QR codes. I'll leave these on the screen, but once we start with the question and answer, I'll also drop the links in the chat. But a very easy way to support us is to sign the petition. You can scan that QR code, and please do share the petition with other people. If you want to volunteer, that QR code goes to our Facebook group. That's the easiest way to sort of stay in the loop with what our campaign is doing. We are very fortunate that the local NAACP chapter, as well as the local nonprofit, the Village Initiative, are letting us table at their upcoming events. There's the Freedom Fest event at Freedom Park this Saturday in the afternoon. So we will be there. And then we will also be at the event on the 19th next week on Wednesday in downtown Williamsburg that the Village Initiative is hosting. And so if you would like to help us, sort of operate those tables and talk to people, I hope this presentation has sort of gotten you acquainted with the issues, but of course I'll be there as well to sort of help. But yeah, we would really appreciate anybody who even has like a hour to spare, who would help us run the table. But there are plenty of other ways to volunteer as well. One thing that in particular we're looking for is to help us set up more speaking engagements where I can share this presentation with more people. We've got some things lined up with some local organizations, some local churches that we're really looking forward to. But we see this as like a campaign that is going to take a lot of raising awareness and mobilizing the community. So if you are involved with an organization or church and would like to speak, my email's up there, so feel free to contact me. And then finally, if you would like to donate to the campaign, there's a lot of promotional materials that we're purchasing to get ready for this these upcoming events. But we also want to host our own events in the future, where we can sort of, get into this topic even more. Perhaps have some historians be guest speakers, things like that. So if you'd like to donate to our campaign and, share that GoFundMe with your friends as well, we'd really appreciate it. But with that, I think that sort of concludes the presentation.